Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Kul Shul Jewish Cultural Community, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. Isaac Asimov, the super prolific Jewish humanist author, said that writing to me is simply thinking through my fingers. And he must have thought a lot. During his long career, Asimov wrote or edited more than 500 books, most notably science fiction, but also mysteries, fantasies, and nonfiction books of various types. In fact, he published in all major categories of the Dewey Decimal Classification, except for some reason in the philosophy and psychology category. The reason I mentioned Dr. Asimov is that he proves the truism that a writer's gotta write, just like a singer's gotta sing, a sewer's gotta sew, a driver's gotta drive, and I suppose a slacker's gotta slack. The secret to being prolific, it seems, is not only being able to do what you love, but having the opportunity to do what you're meant to do. This is something today's guest knows well. She's the author or editor of 80 books on pop culture and counting.
We are happy to have Valerie Estelle Frankel, whose wide-ranging books include Hunting for Meaning in The Mandalorian, The Villain's Journey, and Who Tells Your Story? History, Pop Culture, and Hidden Meanings in the Musical Phenomenon Hamilton. Many of her books focus on women's role in fiction, such as Buffy and the Heroine's Journey, Superheroines and the Epic Journey, and The Many Faces of Katniss Everdeen. Her children's book, Helm for the Holidays, was a PJ Library selection, and she's currently editor of Jewish Science Fiction and Fantasy, publishing an academic series for Lexington Books. Valerie, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
I'm sure you get this question a lot, but how do you maintain such a heavy writing schedule?
I would like to thank the Diet Coke Company for all they've done to make this possible, is my standard answer. And one convention, I went up to the Coke Zero booth and told them I was their biggest fan. They were slipping me free cans all weekend until I had to tell them to stop because I was trying to bounce around. All my hours go into writing. College teaching and so forth tend to be part-time, and I do not maintain a lot of hobbies and so on. I'm just spending all the hours making the writing, editing, and researching happen, quite often all of the above at the same time.
Do you work on multiple projects at the same time?
Not preferred, but it could happen. I do kind of a front burner, back burner system of what's the really high priority stuff. What did I just get an email of that, oops, it's due this week? What could really wait, but I feel like working on it? It's all a balance. Oh, and what's due at the library soon, so I need to give those materials back right away.
So much of what you write is geared towards specific areas of pop culture, all of which have very loyal fan bases, whether it's Game of Thrones, Xena Warrior Princess, Star Wars, DC Comics characters, Marvel Comics characters, you name it. And I'm wondering, do you set out on these projects with a encyclopedic knowledge already in mind, or do you use these as opportunities to learn more about these subjects?
It varies a lot. Right now, I have become the encyclopedia for Jewish science fiction. So if anybody asks me to do an additional project on it, and they have essays, and I've done some shorter books, no sweat at all. Some like She-Ra and Hamilton, I was really enjoying, and while I was watching, I was noticing all kinds of things other people weren't. Sometimes I call my books What Happens When an English Major Watches TV. I wrote my first Buffy book while doing my first watch on Buffy, so I did not know anything, including where we were going with it all. I wrote the definitive book on all of Wonder Woman, every depiction ever, up through the movie, and that was for my first read and watch of all of Wonder Woman, although after that I did all of Superheroines, and having done all of Wonder Woman was a significant, stepping stone on the way to that. So it varies. I would kind of like to become an expert on all of anime and write some books while doing that, but it is such a big field. Having just become an expert on all of Superheroines, it can be overwhelming.
Yeah, do you find that you sort of grow in appreciation for these subjects as you're doing it, or is the ordeal of researching and writing sometimes a detraction and you wish you never got into it in the first place?
I had no idea Jewish science fiction was such a big field before I started it. That was going to be one of my little quick books, and then I got very overwhelmed very quickly and learned why nobody had written the definitive history of all Jewish science fiction, because my current project on this is 500,000 words plus some spin-offs, and that is 5 books for the lay people who don't sit around doing word count all the time.
The subjects that you deal with, the fan bases can be pretty contentious. We're talking Star Wars versus Star Trek, DC versus Marvel, and you seem to be very generous and kind of universal in your taste. Is that a quality that you've noticed or anyone else has pointed out about you? You tend to know and like a lot of different things.
I've certainly seen people come up to my table, look at my spectrum of books and go, yes, you're a fan of all the right things. I'm the fan of the same things. Or, where's this one? I get a lot of, where's this one? To which the answer has to be, I haven't read everything, sorry. A lot of Star Wars versus Star Trek is more of a joke. The majority of people really are fans of everything, or if they hate that one, they don't hate it because it's competing with that other one. They have more specific and personal reasons for hating it with the fire of 1,000 passions or whatever. But yeah, the majority of people, and man, all the little fan tables that are selling, patches for 30 different franchises and all the t-shirts and whatever, they just kind of expect we have a lot of loves.
Yeah, you're not going to please everyone all the time, but I imagine too that a lot of these antagonisms, like you're saying, are kind of stupid.
Kind of on the same tangent, what role do you think your work plays in the wider world of fandom?
They don't walk up and say, I want to talk about your books. They say, I want to talk to you about Game of Thrones or She-Ra, and the response is, sure, fine. I'm sitting here and I've clearly been thinking about Game of Thrones. Bring it on. Some of these would you like to be on a Star Wars panel? Well, I have written so many books about Star Wars that, yes, sure, I think I could handle your hour-long panel. Again, I've got it all encyclopedia'd up in my brain and set to go. And yes, there is the knowledge that, I could speak for another 6 hours, but nobody really wants that. Okay, then. I just did a talk at a steampunk convention on the villain's journey, which was Heroes and Villains was the theme of the convention. And I had my book on the villain's journey, so squishing that down to a 1-hour PowerPoint was easy. And oh, guess what? My audience was a whole bunch of villains, some of whom said that I, helped fill out their backstory by giving them some ideas. So off I go.
For the uninitiated in our audience, how do you define steampunk?
It's Victorian-flavored science fiction, kind of. Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, other stuff like Firefly that's doing space cowboys, any of the, I am wearing, bustles and ruffles and tiny top hats, but I also have a ray gun in my parasol, and it's a fun mashup. It's been in fashion for a decade or two. A lot of people thought that it was going to crumble and blow away, but steampunk is still going strong.
You recently became editor of the Jewish Science Fiction and Fantasy series, and I'm honored to have a book in that series. Thank you very much. Goliath as Gentle Giant, Sympathetic Portrayals in Popular Culture. So in your view, why is it that Jews have been so deeply involved in sci-fi and fantasy, both in terms of creators and consumers?
All right. First of all, lots of people don't know this, but Jews invented what we call American science fiction, which the majority of world science fiction right now is based off this concept of American science fiction. There was this guy named Hugo Gernsback in 1920s New York, and he was a big fan of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, who were about a generation older, but their stuff was not all that plausible. Let's journey to the center of the earth. Let's fire a spaceship out of a gun. Some of this stuff really doesn't work when you try it. And he was an inventor, and he wanted to make a science fiction magazine to get people into STEM and inspire real science, real inventions. His short story famously had so many near-future inventions from dictation machines to radar to all the stuff that hadn't quite been invented but was going to very soon, to something like this Zoom call. So he made this magazine called Amazing Stories, and at a time when Jews could not be hired by an awful lot of serious professions like being real publishers and authors of real stuff, he was happy to hire Jews for his science fiction magazine. So that's the first publisher of science fiction is Jewish, and the second publisher, the third publisher, and the fourth publisher, and an awful lot of their authors. The magazine also inspired the first creation of fan groups, science fiction fandoms. They would meet in fan clubs. We had fan letters, and they were responding to each other in the comments section. We had the first conventions. We had the first fandom feuds, which took place at the first conventions and fan clubs. And all this, the majority of professionals, semi-professionals, amateurs, people who really wanted to be in it, etc., were Jews. So a generation or two later, fewer Jews in the industry, but there's still so many. Also, the exact same thing happened about a street over with superheroes and comic books, and that's a whole Jewish history on which there are a number of good books. So, superheroes too. And there are still all these Jewish creators giving us these Jewish moments in sci-fi fantasy through today. X-Men, Star Trek, Babylon 5. There were just all these talks about a week ago with the end of The Mandalorian, and everyone seeing some really Jewish themes and content and moments in that. And more basically, Judaism and fandom are both about arguing, midrashim and fanfic, and filling in the gaps with what we imagine, throwing oneself into the text, being a super duper super expert on the text. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think there's probably the appeal of the outsider kind of culture as well, because Jews being perennial outsiders, finding their tribe, as it were, at such conventions, and really within fandom and even the writing community, this sort of place where they could thrive and be themselves beyond even the subject matter, I think was probably pretty appealing.
Very good point. In the Gernsback days, we didn't get Jewish characters because Jews were first and second generation Americans and really trying to blend in and do the melting pot thing as opposed to call attention to their cultures. But there was so many anti-fascist stories as Hitler was rising. There were so many stories about outcasts and mutants and anti-prejudice stories that you can really feel the Jewish vibe, and using sci-fi as a metaphor, Asimov and his robot stories, all that stuff.
I feel like this might be a loaded question, not in terms of, the meaning that I'm going to load it with, but at least in terms of the answer, I think. For the uninitiated, who are some of the better-known Jewish contributors to sci-fi and fantasy? Maybe some we might be surprised to know are Jews?
Jon Favreau, one of the showrunners for The Mandalorian, which is why lots of people are seeing Jewish content and seeing some basis behind it. There's so much of this stuff where we could all say, this applies to any minority culture, or all cultures have an initiation ceremony or something. But we were really feeling the mikvah vibe and the returning to the land that they'd been exiled from. And yeah, when we got to the end of that one, we're at the end of season 3 now. Taika Waititi, lots of people don't know, is Jewish. Some themes more times than others, but yeah. Gene Roddenberry was not, but his 2 co-producers were, starting off Star Trek, not just the actors, famously. 2 of the Doctor Who creators were Jewish. So all these shows end up with some amount of sensibility, background, history, culture. Lawrence Kasdan co-wrote a giant pile of Star Wars movies. And he was the one where, when Raiders of the Lost Ark was getting planned out, said, we could make this about the Ark of the Covenant. So there's some big ones in movie and TV. Fiction, a lot of them are very famously Jewish. Mike Resnick, Peter S. Beagle, Esther Frasner, Jane Yolen. It's well known. Neil Gaiman, not everyone knows. Apparently his last name used to be something closer to Hyman. Guy Gabriel Kay, Cory Doctorow, Alfred Bester, Joanna Russ, Carl Sagan. These people in interviews have all been asked and said, yeah, sure, I'm Jewish, just people don't ask a lot or something, as opposed to some of the Jewish creators who put piles and piles of Jewish content in their books. There's a range.
So you've also written some parodies, like Henry Potty and the Pet Rock, and an unexpected parody, the unauthorized spoof of The Hobbit. So what goes into these loving send-ups, and do you think there's anything specifically Jewish about the parody genre?
I definitely think Jews do a lot of parody. I watched so many Mel Brooks movies while I was writing these things. I just wanted the vibe coming in. That and lots of sugar and caffeine. Those vibes too. My parodies, not specifically. I was not using any particular Jewish jokes or Jewish sensibility. Just there are a lot of great Jewish comedians out there, and yes, there is an entire history of all that. So yeah, I just wrote the parodies for fun. And yes, doing them as a geek and a crazed fan of this thing, that thing, the other thing.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion, and this is very kind of subjective, but that a Jew writing a parody is ultimately going to make a Jewish parody, whether they intend to or not, just because of that natural sensibility that's in there somewhere.
Quite possibly. I mean, for Mel Brooks, it's more overt because he's got himself with a Yiddish accent in the majority of the movies coming through and making his jokes. And yeah.
Yeah, he can't help himself. That's for sure.
So aside from your books, which I'm personally really excited to read, Valerie, do you have recommendations for, listeners and other people who might be ready to learn more about Jewish fantasy and sci-fi? What are some good books for them to get an entree to that?
Esther Freisner in the 90s was doing some lovely, humorous girl power fantasy. And around the same time, Mike Resnick was doing some hilarious Jewish short stories. Jane Yolen, very famous for Devil's Arithmetic. Recently, Michael A. Burstein has been doing some wonderful short stories that are really asking some of the big theological questions. And Veronica Shanos has done a lovely anthology of her short stories called Burning Girls that does a lot of historical fantasy. There's been some really nice stuff. There's been some great young adult books. I loved The Way Back, where they go into the realm of death with Death's Magic Spoon. And for Israeli science fiction and fantasy, I've got some friends who put out the anthology Zion's Fiction. Say it fast. Ha, ha, ha. And more Zion's Fiction. And Lavi Tidhar has been translating and bringing over so much Israeli fantasy, which is really quite different if you're interested in going into that. And the anthologies, as I keep going, the anthologies can really be great because they're a sampler, one by this one by that one. So Zion's Fiction would be a little of all the Israeli stuff. Wandering Stars back in the 70s was the original Jewish science fiction anthology, and again, gives you a little bit by so many different authors. They hauled in Asimov to write the introduction. He was sitting there going, well, I haven't really thought about Jewish science fiction, but sure, I'm Jewish, I write science fiction, I sometimes write about God and theology. Let's launch this thing, let's do this. Very recently, the Jewish Book of Horror came out, and that was interesting because throughout all of history, it has just been a thing, especially post-Holocaust, that Jews don't write horror. Or if they do, they're not writing about Jewish horror, they're writing about Catholic as code for Jews or something like that, but Jewish horror is not a thing. Well, this anthology, they asked a bunch of authors, well, if you did try to make something like that, what would it look like? There was an amazing creepy Passover story that gave the final line, let all who are hungry come and eat. Such different meanings. So, I mean, some people are coming out with some very cute, clever, interesting stuff lately. And part of this is the Own Voices movement, where we're being encouraged to write about our backgrounds. And the response from so many authors is, yeah, sure, I'd love to write about my background. Bring it on. One final one. Daniel Jose Older, who is not Jewish but has some Jewish ancestry, wrote a pirate Sephardic Caribbean fantasy in the Rick Riordan Presents series, and I was there with, "Hi, convention, I want to do a presentation on Jewish Sephardic pirate fantasy. Let's talk about this." Yeah, it's all coming out.
That's great. And do you think that anything particular needs to be in a book to make it Jewish science fiction, or is it more subtle than that sometimes?
Stephen H. Silver, who has written the definitive list of Jewish science fiction, if you Google him, you will get all the books, which you might want to do, asked me that and said, what percentage of it has to be Jewish? And I said, maybe 0%. For instance, Where the Wild Things Are has no Jews in it. However, Maurice Sendak grew up very much in the shadow of the Holocaust, and his books are notable for being darker than a lot of children's books are. We have a lot more angry, miserable kids, and it's okay to be angry and miserable in his books. And as Max is acting like a wild child and rebelling and goes off to meet the wild things, well, the wild things were actually based on Maurice Sendak's relatives, who were all hairy and giant and slobbery and saying, "We're going to eat you up, you're so cute." And there they are in the book.
So I'm sure you're working on some projects now. Would you like to share anything about them or plug anything that's new or coming soon?
The anthology of essays, Jewish Fantasy Worldwide, just came out, which really was, okay, can we hear about Jewish fantasy that's coming out of Australia and South America? And there were people going, oh, actually, these stories haven't been translated into English yet from Czech. And I'm going, great, yeah, write me that essay. I'm working on books. I'm working on the trans hero's journey. I'm working on an essay anthology about Bridgerton. And I'm working on my book, Jewish Science Fiction Before 1945 is out. The sequel, which is about the post-Holocaust era, the kind of 60s through 80s, is in the publishing process. And that means that I have finally turned that thing in, and I'm busy writing the one on the 80s through 2000, except that I'm kind of writing them all at once, because why the heck not? If a book comes out this year, I've got it on my to-read list, and that goes in the next volume, and on and on. So sure, all of it at once kind of mixed together.
Well, thank you so much, Valerie. You certainly taught us a lot, and there's so much more to learn. Maybe we'll have you back on sometime. In the meantime, to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.